Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah wa barakatuh, everybody. I am truly grateful to be invited. I have three major disadvantages. Any one would be debilitating. One, I'm speaking after Sheikh Yasir Qadi. Second, I don't know much about the topic. I don't know Islamic finance. And third, I'm the man standing between you and your dinner. But I want to say that to start just the way that Sheikh Yasir Qadi did, we have to start thinking about Gaza, not only because our hearts are heavy, because we have seen a genocide unfold for 13 months. The entire Muslim world, 57 Muslim countries, are unable to do anything about it. We are unable to send a bag of food across the borders to people who are eating grass and starving to death and are being bombed to death. So on the one hand, we are an ummah that has enormous advantages, growing wealth, growing access to the world, and yet at the same time, let this be a motivation rather than a call for, a tragic pessimism that we have a lot of work to do. And no one is more empowered to do that work, and I say that with all humility, than Western Muslims, than Muslims at Harvard, than Muslims at top Ivy League universities, than Muslims in top global institutions. At Ummatics Institute, we study precisely these issues, and we call the most important agents of the Ummah gems, that is globally empowered Muslims. And this is a room filled with globally empowered Muslims. Whether we like it or not, this is a responsibility and an honor that Allah has put on our shoulders, and we must think with Ummah in our mind. Those children who are dying in Gaza, they're our problem. So let me then jump into my topic, Islamic versus market logic, moral economy between the nation state and the Ummah. And I will start by correcting humbly the title, and I left it there because I wanted to draw our attention to the fact that it's not Islamic versus market, but rather it's Islamic market versus capitalist market. Because Islam is very much a market-friendly religion. In fact, trade is a trademark of Islam. And I was just talking to Professor Adil Malik, who is at Oxford, and when I told him the title, this was the first thing that he said, because he talks everywhere he can about the next book he's writing on how trade-friendly and free market-friendly Islam is. But that said, let's start by, I'm going to do three things. First, I'm going to try to define capitalism. Number two, I'm going to explain Islam's stance, which is just a footnote to what Sheikh Yasir said, because I think all that I wanted to say, he has. So what I will say is sort of just a hashia, a footnote to what he said, and finally suggest what we can do about it. So capitalism is the most powerful and also the most destructive phenomenon today, one that is said to have created the modern world. But defining it is hard. Any such attempt has to confront a number of paradoxes. First, capitalism claims to be free market, but it is not free market. It is tied to the nation state, which created the conditions through enormous global violence for free market. But the first paradox that I want to hone in on is that capitalism is associated with interest or usury, which is true enough, but usury existed before capitalism. Clearly, usury is not all capitalism is. The second paradox is that capitalism is associated with secularism, which is also true enough. But capitalism is not infrequently in common cause with religious traditions. There's a great book called To Serve God and Walmart that explains how for American Christians, capitalism is religion. Christian prosperity gospel, the idea that your wealth indicates your favor with God, is a central idea in Protestantism, and it finds its way into Islam through the back door. There is no theological way in Islam to make that claim. Nevertheless, in our attitudes, even through weak hadith and weak traditions, actually you find, just visit Saudi Arabia. Apologies if there is any sensibility there. But there are also other ways in which religion comes to serve the end of profit maximization. How is that possible if capitalism is supposed to be secular? The third paradox is that sometimes capitalism seems to have some genuinely shared interest with religion, or particularly Islam, or any other religion, against shared adversaries such as ethno-nationalism, certain forms of customary and communal authorities, and so on. Capitalism wants freedom to buy and sell, and various forms of local customs, monopolies, and so on, try to prevent that. So my point is that a third paradox is added to by the fact that sometimes capitalism and Islam might in some ways join hands against some of these primordial kind of forces, or and one example would be, for example, the Turkish miracle when AKP joined hands with neoliberal forces in order to push back against the secular military brass. So my point simply is that we have complexities. The stakes of not understanding capitalism, therefore, are high. If we misidentify it, we might think that we are providing an alternative to it, or that we are solving the problems that it has created while in actuality becoming its handmaiden, its tool, or its collaborator. But we live in a world allegedly created by its forces. And a surgical understanding of capitalism is crucial both to resist it, to avoid becoming it, and to also avoid fighting ghosts. Like free market, for example. A simplified way to address these paradoxes is that capitalism is, my definition, deification of profit maximization, right? So turning profit maximization into a god. To get to this definition, consider the more widely known kind of a textbook definition given by Charles Tripp in his book on Islamic moral economy, one of the best books on the subject, somewhat dated. He says, capitalism is the transformation of the market into a supreme institution and dominant metaphor for most social transactions, such that ethical constraints are no longer considered part of the process. So one, capitalism becomes the dominant metaphor through which we understand life, what is good, what is bad, what is profitable, what is value, right? We just heard about that. The second thing is that capitalism does not like constraints except those constraints that its elite create in order to maximize profit. So it is okay with tariffs, it's okay with protectionism, but it likes protectionism and tariffs to benefit the elite. It does not like ethical, religious, or even customary constraints on the movement of money and property. To a Muslim audience, I might explain this better with the analogy of Islam's testimony, La ilaha illallah, there is no God but Allah, and there is a negation then that makes room for the affirmation. Usury and its attending logic of greed, instrumentalization, and secularizing impulse of forgetting Allah and the afterlife are all timeless sins. Yet, in early modern Europe, a confluence of factors such as, and I'm going to name just four, historians have done a tremendous amount of work on it, I can't summarize that, religious ideology of election in Protestant Christianity and the attendant disciplinary revolution, military competition among European wars. So basically, war made the modern state, and modern state made war, and that's where capitalism got this initial energy. Third, evolution of navigation and gunpowder technologies, which sort of is an attendant, but not an internal or indigenous to capitalism. It happened to be there. And number 4, prospects of colonial exploitation. Discovery of America, then British access to India, and so on. All of this weakened the institutional and the spiritual forces in Europe that stood against total triumph of usury and greed. So once this powerful formula is created, it becomes a steroid that gave enormous short-term advantage to whoever took it. And everybody else is forced either to take it or lose the war and the capital wars. Capitalism, in other words, thrives by doing 2 things. By eliminating any impediments in the way of an ancient primordial sin of usury and greed and acquisitiveness, and by raising that sin from an accidental feature of social life to its sole master. These impediments, maybe it's theorized, there are formulas for it, there are departments studying it, because it becomes the center from being what it was, a sin that almost always existed. These impediments may be religious ethics, against greed and acquisitiveness, for instance, that is shared by Christianity and Islam and other traditions. Or it may be religious law, and that is unique to Islam. This is why Islam in particular is the only serious resistance, because ethics is easy to redefine. Religious law is not, and that's where I disagree with my colleague and teacher, Dr. Walid Ansari, who talked about law as somehow being secondary. I think Islamic law is what makes Islam so difficult to swallow for capitalism. But also other institutions, such as feudalism, when property is owned by certain families and not in the market, also prevent capitalism. In other words, some of the things that prevent capitalism may be good and others may not be so good. Secularization, similarly, has been historically necessary for capitalism because it hands the authority of religion to define ethics and law to an elite of this world, those wielding power and capital. Once capitalism has become established, however, it can redefine and repurpose religion, which is why contemporary religion, once it loses its power to exert meaningful force on the human self, on the family, on the political, becomes quite useful for capitalist forces as one of its handmaidens. Meaning religion is very easy to repurpose once the power to define religion is taken from the organic, what Sheikh Yasser was talking about, the endowments and the ulama critiquing each other. Once that power is taken and it is given to the courts or given to the powerful spokespersons for capital, it becomes quite useful, in fact, for capitalism to promote religion. Because religion is actually very good at making myths and allowing or making people swallow them. And that's why it is not good enough for us to say that we are religious and therefore we are fighting the injustice and destruction created by capitalism. You have to be religious in the way that it is meant to be. You have to give Islam its authority back. Okay, so now the second point, the discourse on Islamic economics can be traced to about a century ago when Muslims encountered capitalism after the end of the Ottoman Caliphate, and along with that, the end of the possibility of political resistance to colonialism. This discourse was prescient and piercing, and we need to do more to recover and study it. My good friend, Dr. Sami Dagestani, just written a book about it. Dr. Walid Ansari is writing about it, and so on. This movement created the idea of an Islamic economy from the bits and pieces in Islamic law and ethics by obviously stressing the prohibition of interest and salience of zakah and so on, but they were limited by the constraints of the Cold War politics, the new nation states. So this discourse was then quickly picked up and transformed by the forces of neoliberal globalization starting in the 80s. Neoliberalism can be best understood as capitalism on steroids, drunk in its success of having defeated its only rival, socialism. As now, Islam was not a rival on the world scene at that time. As now, politics was crucial to economics, and OPEC's raising of oil prices in the 1970s to penalize the West for Israel's aggression, in fact, led to the world that we now inhabit. Never again were the Western powers going to allow the Arabs the ability to do such a thing, that is, to raise the oil prices, to penalize the West. Assassinations and coups followed. We're not going to get into that. In this context, Islamic economics gained strength as an acceptable thing to do. But also the rise of oil rents took these ideas from their organic roots and actualized them under the shade of a fanatic form of global capitalism, which meant that it is for Islamic finance to become a thing, first of all, from an Islamic economy to Islamic finance, which is itself quite a transformation. But then for it to become so big, it had to accept the needs of a small elite in the Muslim world. Islamic economic practice, therefore, has become, nevertheless, despite all of this, it has become moderately successful, a successful segment of the capitalist market known for its systematic concern with morality and proving itself as being resilient in certain crises, right, as in 2008. It has also been criticized for mimicking features of larger capitalist markets the more successful it becomes. In other words, that the more money Muslims have, the more we seem to be acting in the same way as the rest of the capitalists, and so people, critics, have good reason to ask, if we give you just the same amount of money as everybody else has, are you going to be exactly the same? Is there anything new about Islamic economics other than simply the fact that you're trying to create a religious-based identity? So there is a challenge for all of us here to think about, especially those of us who are studying, that this is a serious critique for us to think, and I think that this partial failure can be attributed in part to the detachment of Islamic finance and Islamic economics in the neoliberal age from the ummah. Both ummah at the local level and the ummah at the global level. To restore the ethical and communal foundation of Islamic economics, it needs to do what capitalism hates most, to create human beings who will find satisfaction not in purchasing stuff, but in praying, or in serving the family, or being with your parents, or deciding not to move for a job because you want to serve your old aging parents. Those are the acts of resistance to capitalism. So it is essential to focus on the local face-to-face community interactions that form the bedrock of Muslim communities. Trust, reciprocity, and social responsibility are key elements that can only be cultivated within strong local communities. For instance, the Islamic practice of granting a qard hasan, a good loan, which should be forgiven if the borrower is unable to repay, is only realistic in a context where trust and mutual care are deeply ingrained. And I don't mean these as merely virtues, but in the very structure of how we live. In a globalizing world, if consequences of my actions are distant, being part of a, I do not care much. I may be a very kind person. I may be somebody who destroys villages through my decisions, and then I go back and love my grandchild. As a person, I'm very good, but the consequences of my actions are distant, and so it is that which allows capitalism to be so powerful and yet be so nefarious. Okay, so my final point, call to action. Ultimately, Islamic economics can only be successful if it remains rooted in both local communities and broader sense of global solidarity within the ummah. By restoring the ethical, communal, and spiritual dimensions of economic life, Islamic economics can offer a viable alternative to the secular, individualistic model of capitalism that dominates much of the world today. But remember that capitalism was a global and expansionist force. You cannot resist capitalism by embracing a capitalist globalization while merely doing spirituality at home. You have to think ummatically. So with that, I will end with reiterating these three points that I have made. First, I want to go back to the point that Dr. Walid Ansari made and Sheikh Yasir made, which is your aim should be to be among the muqarrabun, those who are close to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That is the greatest resistance to the nefarious logic of capitalism, whether it's praying or upholding Islamic social norms or being good to parents or being modest and having haya. These are acts of resistance. Number two, recognize the success of our families, success of our Islamic great tradition in the past, and success of the Islamic economic discourse of the last century. History, nevertheless, whether it's ancient history or contemporary, should be taken as an inspiration but not a glass ceiling. We can and do better. We can and must do better. Finally, recognize your power as being what I call gems. Be ummatic and understand that your center of gravity, as you think about the world, should be the ummah. And think of the ummah, use your power to link with the ummah and link the ummah horizontally. So one great example of that is what we heard with Dr. Mukhlisin in an earlier panel about the wonderful experiments, social experiments, economic experiments that are going on in Indonesia. Muslim countries, 56 Muslim countries, have a lot more to learn from Indonesia and to teach each other than we have to learn from the West, trust me. And we have no mechanisms to do that kind of horizontal learning. So regional Muslim trade between Muslim countries, if you look at the trade between or among OIC countries, and I'm going to end here, is what percentage? Can anybody tell me? Between 57 Muslim countries, what percentage of their total trade is within? 20%. The number I have is 3%. And that tells you that Muslim trading is completely dependent on this vertical relationship with their former and current colonizers and imperialists. And there is a tremendous revolution to be had if we are able to simply trade more. So with that, I thank you for your patience, and we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to allow us to be better support to the less fortunate in the ummah, and to be among those who can stand before Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and say that we did our best, even in the middle of the genocide, even in the middle of so much injustice, whether it's in India or in Gaza or in Kashmir, we did our best. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.